Chapter 1. The Genesis of Genesis. Genesis is an ancient story. This may sound obvious, maybe even a bit patronizing. Of course, it's an ancient story. But once we look at what this means, that short statement might be the most important thing to remember about Genesis. It will guide the rest of this book, showing us how to approach Genesis and what we should expect from it. Depending on our past exposure to the Bible, some of us might approach Genesis expecting to find a detailed account of history, as though it's a modern textbook. Of course, by calling Genesis a story, we are not saying anything about whether it is historical or fictional. Any book about the American Revolution or the Cuban Missile Crisis is just as much a story as Moby Dick, Game of Thrones, or Modern Family. But Genesis is not a textbook, history, science, or otherwise. Let the teenager in us rejoice. Instead of a textbook, some of us might approach Genesis as a book of principles to teach us how to live. But if we approach a story like a book of principles, it is likely we will find ourselves wanting to know what every passage means for me. Imagine trying to watch a riveting blockbuster or a moving drama while pausing it every 5 minutes to ponder how each scene might apply to your life. Stories do apply to our lives, perhaps more than any other form of literature, but not as abstract principles or proverbs. They apply when our personal story collides with them, when we get lost in the world they present to us, even to the point where we begin to be defined by them. So, when we read Genesis as an ancient story, written at a particular time to a particular people, it opens up possibilities and worlds we don't encounter in our limited existence. When we stop using Genesis as an argument, a textbook, or a code of conduct, and begin to see it as an ancient story with memorable characters, twists and turns, ups and downs, accomplishments and mistakes, we find it fresh, deep, and more true and relevant than we might expect. The best stories shape our lives precisely because as we read them, we are presented with both reality and possibility. The characters and circumstances resonate with us because they are mirrors of our own story, reminding us that we are not alone in our experiences. But they also pull us toward another world that we are less familiar with, a world that is often strange and sometimes dangerous, a world that doesn't show us what is, but what is possible. Why would we expect anything less at the beginning of the story of God's relationship with humanity? But in order to see Genesis through ancient eyes, we have to admit that our modern eyes might get in the way. So this chapter is eye surgery. It is meant to help us suspend our 21st century gaze and allow us to enter a new way of looking at the world. Genesis is book 1 in a series. Imagine if someone said to you that they understood your favorite epic saga, perhaps Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. But then you come to find out that they have only read the first book in the series. How much of the story could they possibly have understood? Doesn't the beginning of the story really only make sense in light of the middle and the end? In the same way, if you want to get a handle on Genesis, and you do, which is why you bought this book, you really have to take a step back and recognize that Genesis is the first book of a 5-part series. The shorthand title for this series among scholars is the Pentateuch, from the Greek 5 scrolls, and it contains the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So, Genesis is the Fellowship of the Ring, Philosopher's Stone, Hunger Games, Twilight. Did we miss anyone? Of the Pentateuch. And since Genesis is the first book in a series, We will miss a lot if we don't take time to better understand the entire story of the Pentateuch first. The Pentateuch is very old, far older than Christianity. It comes to us from the ancient Israelites, who called these first 5 books of the Torah from the Hebrew law or instruction. And it's useful for us to understand why the ancient Israelites call this 5-part story the Torah. Just like the title to most movies and books, it gives us a hint as to what the story is about. And much to your surprise, it's not called the Torah because it's a list of tedious thou shalt and thou shalt nots to skip over. Don't get us wrong. Laws make up a central element of the Torah, even if many of us find them tedious, odd, and awkward, like laws concerning mildew, wet dreams, eating pork or camel meat, what kind of bird to sacrifice, what happens if your bull gores a neighbor, etc., etc. Snooze. If you read the Pentateuch, you'll have to take all that in stride, or just keep doing what you've been doing and skip those parts. Jews, however, call these 5 books Torah because the climactic moment of the entire story is when their specific God, named Yahweh, meets with Israel on Mount Sinai and gives Israel the instructions for how to be God's people after they are delivered from Egypt in the book of Exodus. The Israelites are camped out at Mount Sinai for a little more than half of the Pentateuch. Clearly, this period is the center of the story, the event that everything before is leading up to and everything after is reflecting on. Mount Sinai is when the Israelites receive God's law, hence the name Torah. And this law is central to their identity as God's people. It reveals their relationship to God as God's people and their relationship to the land as God's gift. In other words, the story of Israel finds its climax at Sinai because there they find out, 1, who they are as God's people, and 2, how to maintain a life-giving relationship with God in the Promised Land. So, if we are going to read Genesis as the ancient Israelites would have, we have to read it as a story that propels us to the dramatic and climactic events at Mount Sinai. We shouldn't be surprised to find in Genesis some of the same themes we find at Sinai. Again and again in Genesis, we will find hints of where the story is headed. If the events at Mount Sinai are the climax of the Pentateuch, the message of the Pentateuch is this. Listen up, Israel. Yahweh is the creator of the cosmos. Yahweh also redeemed you from Egypt and promised you the land of Canaan as a home. You were Yahweh's people, and Yahweh alone is your God, worthy of your complete devotion. That's what the story of the Pentateuch is getting at, and why the events at Sinai are so central. The Pentateuch story reminds, even admonishes, Israel that Yahweh and no other God is to be worshipped. Worshipping other gods in the ancient world, with every house, village, and nation having its own list of favorites, was as easy as deciding between restaurants today. But in the midst of all this choice between gods, the Pentateuch reminds the Israelites that they are to remain loyal to one God, that Yahweh alone is worthy of worship. Why? Because this God alone is, 1, the creator of the world, and 2, the savior of Israel. Okay, so where does Genesis come in? Genesis sets the stage by focusing on 1 and hinting at 2. The rest of the Pentateuch focuses on 2, the Exodus from Egypt, while reminding us of 1. And once you get outside of the Pentateuch, much of the Old Testament still centers on these 2 themes. usually by showing Israel how Israel tends to forget them. Genesis introduces us to God as the creator and gives us previews of God as the savior. Actually, we'll see that creating and saving are two sides of the same coin. To sum up, we are saying that Genesis has to be read as a story to be understood properly. But the story we find in Genesis was written in a world that looked very different than ours. If we are to read it well, we must also read it through ancient eyes. Genesis is ancient. It's easier to understand what you are reading if you know when it was written and under what circumstance. George Orwell's Animal Farm might make sense as a cute, better disturbing story about talking animals. But knowing when it was written, 1945, and the circumstances that led to it being written, a critique of Joseph Stalin's oppressive communist regime, will alert us that the book is actually an allegory. If you don't catch that, you will miss the whole point. In other words, knowing at least something about the historical context of a story, when a story was written and under what circumstances, makes you a better reader. The same is true of Genesis. Just because Genesis is in the Bible doesn't mean we can read it any way we please. And it certainly doesn't mean that the stories were written with 21st century readers in mind. Whether we say that Genesis was written by ancient Israelites or even by God to ancient Israelites doesn't change the fact that Genesis was written a long, long time ago in a language that is now essentially dead. Israelis today speak a different form of Hebrew. Genesis is really old, and if we are going to read it well, we have to make adjustments in our thinking. How ancient is Genesis? So, when exactly in the ancient world was Genesis written? What was happening in the life of Israelites or in the world around them? Here we run into our first problem with Genesis and most any other piece of ancient literature. Genesis is an anonymous book. Genesis has no title page, no author's name, no date of publication stamped into it, no dedication page. Jewish and Christian traditions have generally labeled Moses as the author of the Pentateuch. After all, he is the main character. But there are very few good reasons why that label won't stick. And biblical scholars have been talking about them for the past 300 years, and a few Jews and Christians long before that. For one thing, it would be slightly creepy for Moses to have written the Pentateuch since it records his death and burial in Deuteronomy chapter 34. The writer even tells us that to this day, no one knows where Moses is buried, chapter 34, verse 7, and that since Moses' day, no one has ever arisen like him, chapter 34, verses 10 through 12. That sounds like it was written by someone a long time after Moses' death, looking back to the good old days. Actually, the whole Pentateuch reads like a story about the distant past, with Moses and other characters spoken of in the third person. The Pentateuch is a story about Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and about Moses and the Israelites who left Egypt and went to Mount Sinai. It's a bit odd to think of Moses talking about himself in the third person. Only NBA players do that. Plus, in one place in the Pentateuch, we read that Moses was more humble than anyone on earth. Numbers chapter 12, verse 3. Would a truly humble man write about himself in this way? It makes more sense to say someone else at a later time described Moses as humble. There are other reasons that clue us in that someone other than Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but we don't need to take time for that here. If you're dying to know, however, check out the other books we recommend in the further reading section at the end of this book. The real question is, who did write it and when did he live? To answer that question, scholars have had to engage in some historical detective work, and their detective skills have led them to agree that the Pentateuch as we know it didn't come together until sometime after 539 BCE, about 700 to 1,000 years before the period of Moses. This is a significant year for Jews. The year 539 BCE is when the Persian king Cyrus defeated the Babylonians, thus releasing the Israelites who had been captive of Babylon since 586 BCE. When we say the Pentateuch as we know it came together sometime after 539 BCE, we do not mean to say it was written from scratch during that time. There were certainly older writings and oral traditions that have been around for hundreds of years. But it was sometime after the Israelites returned to their homeland that all of these older writings and oral traditions were compiled and edited in a way we now have them in our Bible. So, rather than viewing the Pentateuch as a song written by one artist at one time, it should be seen as a remix that takes samples of other work and puts them together in a fresh way to tell a single story. This goes for Genesis too. Why would anyone come to this conclusion? Because there are clues in Genesis that point us in this direction, some of which have been noted by Jewish and Christian readers for hundreds of years. For example, in the Abraham story, Genesis chapter 12 verse 6 and chapter 13 verse 7, we read that the Canaanites were living in the land then or at that time. If the Canaanites were living in the land then, it makes sense that the writer is writing at a time when the Canaanites were not in the land. And according to the biblical story, it wasn't until the days of Kings David and Solomon that the final Canaanite element was effectively driven out, which was sometime after 1000 BCE. So, here we have a clue, at least in part, that part of Genesis comes from sometime after 1000 BCE, though it is telling us a story set in Abraham's day, about 2100 BCE, as the Bible presents it. Another example is Genesis 36, where we read a list of the kings of Edom. The writer introduces the list this way. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom, before any king reigned over Israelites. The writer says, before any king reigned, because he lived during or after the time when Israel did have kings, which again did not happen until about 1000 BCE. For these reasons and others, scholars feel that Israel's story began to be written down around the time of King David. That's when the Israelites were pretty settled in the land of Canaan and had some relative peace and quiet to think things through. And now that they were a nation, they certainly began to keep records, which were the foundations for books like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings that recount the reigns of Israel's kings and write down their songs for worship, psalms. They probably also began writing down their own ancient oral stories, recording their traditions from hundreds and hundreds of years back. Israel's national catastrophe. Writing Israel's story probably started around the time of King David, but it went into hyperspeed when the Israelites went through the trauma of the exile as they were taken out of their country and into Babylon in the 6th century BCE. Why would they make them write more? The Israelites believed God had promised ages earlier to give them the land of Canaan to be theirs forever. He also promised that they would have a line of kings descended from King David who would reign from Jerusalem forever. You can read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 7. But Israel, especially the kings, had blown off God for so long that, as the story goes, God gave them over to their enemies, the Babylonians, who had recently become the superpower. The Babylonians marched into Jerusalem and by 586 BCE had bulldozed the temple, God's sacred house, and taken much of the population captive. And so Israel looked around. No king, no land, no temple. Who is Israel without a king, without a land, and without a temple? It looked like God had broken God's promise and abandoned his own people. It's not hard to imagine then why the Israelites at this time did some soul searching. They looked back at their ancient past to make sense of the tragedy of their recent history. In view of all that happened, are we still God's people? Does Yahweh still care for us? How can we make sure that this doesn't happen to us again? Will we ever regain the glory of our past? To address these very real and pressing questions, they began retelling their story one last time. That telling became what Christians call the Old Testament. Think of the Old Testament as Israel's story, written in light of national trauma to encourage continued faithfulness to God. The Pentateuch recounts how the Israelites got their start and how God stuck by them and gave them the gift of law and the tabernacle on Mount Sinai. It also reminds them of how they got into this mess, their failure to be faithful to God. He was faithful to them. Renewing their commitment to their faithful God was the front burner issue now that they were back home after the exile. The Pentateuch encouraged them that God's faithfulness can always be counted on, no matter what. The Pentateuch is Israel's constitution. This is who we are. This is where we have come from. This is what we believe. And most importantly, this is what our God is like. God has always been faithful to us in the past, no matter how badly we screwed up. But God also commands us to be faithful. Let's make sure we remember all this so we won't be carried off by another nation ever again. The Israelites were humiliated and held captive by the Babylonians for about 50 years. Throw into the mix the fact that a generation or two was born in Babylon during the exile, meaning they likely had no personal connection to the past. When you put it that way, a book that ties together past and present sounds like a great idea. Think of Eastern European immigrants to America talking about the old country, and within a generation their children are getting Metallica tattoos and body piercings. The possibility of caving into Babylonian customs and Babylonian gods was a constant pressure. So it's not surprising that some stories in Genesis seem to be explicitly anti-Babylon. We'll see examples as we go. So, how we read Genesis depends on us knowing these circumstances, just like knowing about Stalin is vital for understanding Animal Farm. Knowing that Genesis, as we have it in our Bibles, is written as a part of the Pentateuch, and that the Pentateuch is written as Israel's constitution in light of the traumatic events of the Babylonian exile, helps us read the story with ancient eyes. As an analogy, think of the American Declaration of Independence. This document established America's national identity and was written at a time of crisis to oppose the British oppressors. With all due apologies to our British friends. If you didn't know that background, it would be difficult to understand why the Declaration of Independence sounds like it does. Imagine an archaeologist unearthing the Declaration of Independence 5,000 years from now without knowing anything about America and its fight for independence. Without a working knowledge of what the colonists were opposing, the words of their declaration not only lose a lot of their force, but are also open to gross misinterpretation. In the same way, when we see that the Pentateuch Israel's constitution, is partly written as a theological response to Babylonian captivity, some important pieces fall into place. We have spent this chapter saying something rather simple. You cannot properly understand Genesis without seeing it first in its context, not ours. Genesis not only begins the story of Israel and should be read in conversation with the rest of that story, but it is also a story that is told through the eyes of an ancient people in national crisis. The Bible truly has a story to tell and a point to make, and it all begins in the beginning. Keeping both of these points in mind, let's turn to the first book of our Bible, Genesis.